Welcome back, Focus Learners. Today we're diving into a really fascinating, honestly kind of hidden aspect of our psychology. We're looking at a dynamic that goes totally unnoticed by most people, but it literally shapes how we navigate the world as adults. We're unpacking the invisible burden of growing up with emotionally immature parents. We're going to break down exactly why this happens, how it affects us now, and most importantly, how to actually heal from it.
But right off the bat, I want you to think about this question. Why does healthy conflict feel way more threatening than toxic silence? Seriously, think about it. Have you ever been absolutely terrified of just having a calm, direct conversation with a partner, but weirdly you're completely fine enduring days of icy, passive-aggressive silence? Well, you're not alone. And that reaction, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's deeply tied to an unseen past. So today, we're going to connect the dots between those adult anxieties and the environments we grew up in.
Okay, so let's map out our journey for this explainer. First, we'll look at the invisible childhood burden, then the signs of immature parents. After that, we'll cover the adult relationship impact, and finally, what real healing actually looks like. Let's dive right in. Part 1, the invisible childhood burden. Now, what makes this whole thing so incredibly tricky to spot is that adult children of emotionally immature parents usually don't have these dramatic, movie-like stories of abuse. Actually, from the outside looking in, their childhoods probably looked perfectly fine. It's what we call an invisible paradox. You can have a parent who was genuinely loving, but at the exact same time, genuinely unable to be emotionally present. Like, they definitely provided for you, right? They drove you to soccer practice, made sure you did your homework, the whole shebang. But what was fundamentally missing was a parent who could be a safe container for your feelings, or who could model real emotional regulation. It's a really confusing reality for a kid to live in, which is exactly why it takes us so long as adults to finally put a name to what we experienced. So let's give it that name. Clinical psychologist Lindsay Gibson characterizes emotionally immature parents as individuals who prioritize their own emotional needs, lack empathy, and frequently display childish behaviors. We're talking impulsivity, irresponsibility, and some intense emotional reactivity. And our sources point out that this immaturity in the parent is usually the result of their own early trauma, insecure attachments, or untreated mental health stuff. Having the specific clinical vocabulary is an absolute game changer. It finally gives us a real framework to understand what was actually happening behind closed doors. Moving on to part 2, signs of immature parents. Okay, so how did this actually shape your day-to-day reality as a kid? Well, our source material highlights 3 major signs. First off, you became the parent. You literally had to manage their emotions before you even learned to manage your own. You just knew when to stay quiet, when to fix things, or when to just disappear, because, well, someone had to keep the peace. Second, your own feelings were treated as totally inconvenient. If you cried, you were told to stop. If you got angry, you were punished. You learned real quick that the safest emotion was no emotion at all. And third, you never learned what healthy conflict repair looks like. Emotionally immature parents, they don't apologize. They don't sit comfortably with being wrong. So you grew up thinking conflict just ends in silence, or someone storming off, or you just giving in. And I want to be super clear here. These coping strategies were brilliant. You did exactly what you had to do to survive that specific environment. Now, that first sign we just discussed actually has a clinical name. It's called parentification. This is when a child takes on a caretaking or emotional support role for the parent, a role that absolutely should have gone the other way around. And we're not just talking about doing extra chores around the house. It's about being the emotional anchor for the adult who is supposed to be anchoring you. The research on this is pretty stark. It links childhood parentification to major mental health strain later on, including way higher rates of anxiety and depression when you reach adulthood. And this beautifully, or maybe I should say tragically, illustrates exactly why this dynamic is so exhausting. Think about a child's internal bandwidth. When a kid is parentified, a massive chunk of their emotional energy, let's call it 90%, is completely eaten up just managing the parent's unpredictability. That leaves practically nothing, maybe 10%, for the kid to figure out who they are, what they actually want, or how to manage their own internal world. All right, part 3, the adult relationship impact. Here's the kicker. Those incredibly smart, protective childhood survival skills, they don't magically expire on your 18th birthday. Instead, they quietly mutate into patterns that totally sabotage your adult relationships. For example, a great survival strategy as a kid might be playing the role of the highly rational, super capable, calm one. You needed that role to balance out your parents' chaos. But the consequence today?
That exact same strategy leaves you profoundly disconnected from your own emotional needs. Another huge one is holding on to the hope that your parent will eventually change. In adulthood, that translates into constantly chasing emotionally unavailable partners or mistaking anxious, dramatic conflict for real intimacy, just because that chaotic dynamic feels like home.
So, growing up like this leaves some pretty heavy, lasting effects on our emotional development. First up is chronic self-doubt. You constantly second-guess your own feelings and decisions, which makes sense, right? Your reality was invalidated your entire childhood. Next is a real difficulty forming healthy relationships. Without a good parental model, things like trusting a healthy dynamic, setting firm boundaries, and experiencing genuine intimacy are incredibly tough. And lastly, emotional exhaustion. Years and years of navigating emotional unpredictability inevitably leads to deep burnout, flashes of anger, or sometimes just numbing out your feelings entirely.
Which brings us to our final section, what real healing looks like. Now, the point of this explainer isn't to just blame your parents forever. It's about finally understanding why certain toxic relationship patterns feel so magnetic and why they're so darn hard to break. But before we get into the steps, listen to this quote from the sources, because it's a profound realization. Healing doesn't mean becoming someone who is no longer affected by it or turning the relationship completely neutral. That's not healing. That's dissociation with better PR. Honestly, I love that phrasing. Shutting down your emotions entirely or pretending you just don't care anymore, that is absolutely not the goal. The real goal is genuine emotional safety.
So, what do the actual phases of true healing look like? Well, step one is recognition. You have to look at your childhood clearly, maybe for the very first time, and catch yourself when you're replaying an old family role instead of being your authentic self. Step two is building self-trust. You have to start validating your own experiences instead of waiting for someone else to tell you your feelings are real. Step three, boundaries. This is a big one. It means finally putting your own well-being first rather than bending over backwards for everyone else's comfort. And step four is choosing safe relationships. You actively start picking partners and friends who bring consistency and emotional safety to the table, instead of that familiar, chaotic inconsistency you grew up with.
And here's a really important takeaway. Many people do heal while still keeping in contact with their parent, but the nature of that contact fundamentally changes. They might visit less often, they definitely limit deep emotional topics, and most importantly, they start relating from a place of realistic expectations, rather than that childhood fantasy that the parent will suddenly wake up and change. Remember, the goal isn't to fix the parent. You literally can't.
The real goal of healing is to finally put down a burden that was never yours to carry in the first place. So as we wrap up, I want you to reflect on everything we've uncovered today and ask yourself this: what family role are you finally ready to stop carrying? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Keep learning, keep reflecting, and I will see you in the next explainer.